all hear me okay with my microphone in the back? Okay. Well, I'm going to start off with letting you know that I am here. I am one person representing many people, many collaborations, including Drs. Jessica Meisel and Kathleen Quigley, who are part of some of the work that I'll be sharing today. There's multiple funding sources that have funded the work that I'll be sharing, so I want to make that clear as well. I also want to thank the Hanover Forest Science Seminar Series and the committee for organizing my trip. Specifically, I communicated with Justin Kunkel, Lauren Cooper, and Katie James, who made arrangements for me to be here. And I couldn't even be here at all if it wasn't for Jessica's nomination and invitation for me to be here. This is really exciting. I've hardly been to Lower Michigan, so this is a new visit for me to meet the staff and faculty and students over the next couple days. So thank you for these arrangements. I really appreciate it, and it's a good opportunity for us all for communicating and networking. So let's talk about fire. This is going to require some participation. Who in this room is comfortable with a fire in their fireplace? Raise your hand. Okay, the barometer is pretty comfortable. Let's move outdoors. How about a fire in a fire pit? Raise your hand who's comfortable. Okay, about 100%. Fire outdoors, but let's talk about prescribed fire. Maybe in a prairie restoration. Who's comfortable with this use of fire? Raise your hand. Okay. How about a wildfire outside your community? Every time I think of that and I look at this picture, my stomach does a flip. Fire has been a part of human life for a long time. It draws a lot of emotion from comfort to discomfort. It's catching the attention of the media. People like to talk about fire. And thankfully, for the next 40 minutes, I'm going to stay in the comfort zone of this room and talk about prescribed fire. I'll be talking about prescribed fire as a tool in restoration for northern dry forest ecosystems in our region. I'll be talking about its effects, how they vary from having very minimal effects to very significant and persistent effects. And also talking about prescriptions, how timing and frequency influence those effects that we see on the landscape. So fire-adapted ecosystems composed of fire-adapted species, they've evolved with disturbance, fire for many years. Disturbance creates patches in these landscapes, patches of open habitat, and patches of closed canopy forest where there's been minimal disturbance for a long time. So you'll see this gradient in these fire-dependent landscapes. So in this photo, I have an example of closed forest and open habitat. Over time, from what we understand, fire disturbance moved these patches over time over that landscape. The open, savanna, woodland, forest, that continuum of different tree densities and different openness. So a very complex, dynamic system. Now watch this photo. Here's this photo in 2010. You can see those open habitats are now closed forest habitats. What we see in many fire-adapted ecosystems, not just here in the Lake States, but other places around the globe, is the loss of these open habitats. There's lots of reasons for this. Here in the Lake States, some of those reasons are European settlement of these landscapes, failed attempts at farming, tree planting, suppression of fire, and so forth, that have dampened that dynamic and allowed those patches to now become one more homogeneous patch. This causes some concern for our current conditions. In this patch, there's a lot of homes now in this landscape. So there's a public safety concern because there's been an accumulation of fuels and possibility for wildfires around these homes, like I showed in that earlier picture. There's loss of habitat for species that depend on open habitat. Some wildlife species cannot complete their life cycle without open habitat available to them. And lastly, loss of some of the ecological function. So shifts from fire-adapted species to fire-sensitive species. Here's an example. One of the projects that I work on is called the Lakewood Southeast Project. The description I just described of the landscape applies to this landscape. In fact, those photos are from this exact area. And here there's a picture of the tree planting in the 1930s. The open habitat was considered being unproductive. It wasn't being put to good use, and so tree planting would be appropriate. What they learned is that these nutrient-poor soils were not the best sites for timber production. There would actually be better sites to be growing timber. And so today we see a lot of overgrown stands with a lot of fuels, again, contributing to some of the problems I mentioned on the earlier slide. This project is located in the southeast corner of the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest in Wisconsin. The project area, the managed area, is one of our study areas, and we're using these references. These are state natural areas that still have open habitat as benchmark for this managed area. So just as an example of some of the mismatch between where we are now and the desired future condition, I have basal area or forest stocking for conifer stands and hardwood stands. These are the mature trees, so anything 4.5 inches and larger in diameter. And you can see, no matter what forest type, there's a high stocking in the managed area or the project area, and lower stocking in the reference areas. In the open habitats that were not planted to trees, they have woody encroachment. So here we're looking at the density of stems on the Y and shrubs and small trees. So everything knee-high up to 1 inch diameter. And you can see this thick brush layer in these open habitats within the project area. So for the project, some of the objectives are reducing densities of the forest, reducing that understory woody encroachment, reducing the fuels around the homes in these areas, and establishing the desired mixture of fire-adapted species. And over the long term, the goal over these acres is to move back to that patch dynamic over time. How are they going to do this? They're going to use a variety of tools, from commercial timber harvest, mechanical tools, and prescribed fire. So in this photo right here is commercial timber harvest, illustrating that reduction from highly stocked, closed canopy forest to more of a woodland condition. Prescribed fire is one of the essential tools, at least that they're considering essential. However, they're not clear on what the effects are going to be to meet their objectives. But regardless, it's considered an important tool to restoration. Because of all of those tools that I mentioned, it's prescribed fire that's going to bring back some of those properties more closely to what natural fire would have put into these ecosystems. So I'll add to the problem slide, how effective is prescribed fire in these restoration projects for something like woody encroachment? Well, fortunately, this Lakewood Southeast project is not our only restoration projects. There's several here in Michigan, others in Wisconsin, and the Muckle Barrens, which I work with Jessica and Kathleen on, is another example of a large-scale restoration. The Muckle Barrens has the same history as the Lakewood project. Similar goals and objectives and similar tools are going to be used. What's different here, though, is in the 1950s, they designated part of this project area, right here, this was a wildlife management area for a game bird, the sharp-tailed grouse. So this caught their attention to maintain that open habitat so this game bird could complete its life cycle. And so they've been using mechanical and prescribed fire for decades in this region here. So on this map, the yellow indicates open habitat and the darker colors are forest habitat. In 2009, this is on National Forest land, the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest expanded that objective beyond just the game bird, more of an ecological approach, more landscape approach, to look at a wider range of conditions and think about more of that complex landscape. And so the desired future condition is larger patches, as you can see here. So this is a map from their guiding document for this project area. And I should mention this is the tip of Wisconsin right here and going into Lake Superior. So this site is at the far north end of Wisconsin. Now, one of the problems when you begin to expand these patches and you remove a forest to create open land habitat is that woody encroachment in the new conditions. Now, for this ecosystem, it's red pine, jack pine on one spectrum, and then pine barrens at the open land habitat. Key species for this open land habitat include sweet fern and blueberry. And you'll note here the scatter of the jack pine and red pine. So this would be a good example of some of the open habitat that this would be a desired future condition. The reality is a lot of the acres look like this. So deciduous, hardwoods, both shrubs and trees that have incredible resprouting ability. Now there is functions for sprouters in fire-adapted ecosystems. After a severe fire, they can come in and stabilize the site and retain some of those nutrients on site. Here's a list of some of the other species that you would find at the Muckle Barren site that can sprout. Managing woody encroachment, there's several different tools. Prescribed fire is one that we'll be talking about, but there's also mechanical brush cutting, mastication, roller chopping. There's a number of different methods in addition to chemical methods. The Muckle Barrens, the focus of our work, we look at some different tools, but our major focus is on the prescribed fire effects. Now, applying prescribed fire and other wood encroachment tools, timing is important. And so you'll hear people say, oh, it was a dormant season burn. Oh, it was a growing season burn. Well, these season of burns are broad categories representing a number of different things. They can represent the fuel conditions. So in the dormant season, this could mean the litter layer is dry and can help carry that fire and contribute to the fuels. In the dormant season, it could mean better smoke management compared to the growing season. It could mean there's just more personnel available because during the summer, a lot of the trained personnel are out suppressing wildfires out west, at least for our region. Timing can also mean plant physiology, so thinking about where these plants are in their growth cycle. Leaf on is an important time, and especially early leaf on. So just think about coming out of the spring into the growing season, those carbohydrate reserves in the roots are being sent up to start developing those young leaves. And before those young leaves are fully developed, they're not sending carbohydrates back to replace that in the root system. So the thought is hitting them at that time, top killing them, you're going to decrease their ability to resprout because they're going to have lower stocks of carbohydrates in their roots. So at the Muckle Barrens, they have aimed, and during our research period, for these dormant season, early leaf on timing with their prescribed fires. So this gave us opportunity to look at a number of different variables. Many of them I do not have time to talk about today. I'm just going to talk about some of the woody encroachment objectives. So we looked at woody encroachment, where it was before the fire, right after the fire, and then 1 year later. And this is aiming again at about knee-high to shoulder-high, that woody vegetation and that size class. Real simply, this is density, trees per acre. The initial condition, pre-fire, you can see the distribution here. Post-fire, that immediate top kill, just about 100%. And 1 year later, the distributions look really similar. Because we have a team that works on soils, that works on the fire properties, that works on fire severity and all these different things, we know a lot about what's going on. And here's one of the concepts that I'll illustrate here is we know approximately that duff layer was about 1 inch pre-fire. These rhizomes for many of these sprouting species are sandwiched right between the duff layer and the mineral soil layer. And we know moisture was about, in this duff layer, 45 to 50% around that time. Post-fire, we see the top kill, which was great. But we also had other measurements. We know duff consumption was about 0.2 of an inch. And because this duff layer was very moist, it takes a lot of energy to heat up water. And so the energy from that fire was dissipated, and that soil heating did not continue to damage these underground root structures, these rhizomes. So I believe to burst living cells, you have to raise your temperature to about 140 degrees Fahrenheit. That temperature wasn't attained at this level in the soil layer. So these root systems were essentially unharmed and able to resprout. Here's a picture of what this looks like, the top kill, and 1 year later. So how effective is prescribed fire when you have an objective like woody encroachment? Well, based on this limited information I gave you, it would suggest maybe very little impact. However, I've just shown you one fire and one season, one prescription and its effects. So let's look at more variety of prescriptions. And we're fortunate to have here in the Lake States the longest running prescribed fire study for pine ecosystems. And this is located in northern Minnesota. There is no yahoos on this. It's about 60 years old. This is exciting to me. This study was naturally regenerated after a wildfire. So in 1960, when this study started, this stand was already 90 years old. The understory was dominated by mostly hazel, but other deciduous small trees and shrubs. Hazel is very shade tolerant, has incredible sprouting ability, it forms clones and large root systems within that duff and mineral soil mat. So it's a strong player in this game, and it's tough to work with. Now, the idea in 1960, they weren't talking about landscape restoration and all of this kind of stuff. It was about timber production and naturally regenerating red pine. It was difficult to do, and the thought even then, after decades of fire suppression, is that this hazel, this clone, has taken over these understories and was one of the problems, one of the stoppers to allowing red pine to regenerate. And so looking at some of the other pine ecosystems in the United States, the thought was if we could test a few different prescriptions, we can knock back this shrub, expose mineral soil, create the substrate and some growing conditions that would be good for natural regeneration of red pine. So even though the objectives were different at that time, this is still applicable to our uses today in restoration, because we're still looking at reintroducing fire and setting back species and conditions like this. So this study looked at different seasons of burn, dormant season and growing season burns, and different frequencies. The active fire period was from 1960 to 1970, which means there was 10 summer burns, there was 10 spring burns, there was 5 summer biennial burns, 5 biennial, and so forth. So I'll just show you some of the short-term results first. So this came from year 4 of the study. This is going to be hazel density here on the Y. Season is on the X, and each bar is going to be the different frequencies. And then I just noted up here how many burns each bar represents. So at year 4, here's the control, did nothing. Let's compare that to the dormant season burn. So burning 4 times, burning 2 times, burning 1 time in the spring elevated the hazel density. When we look at the summer burns, burning 4 times in the summer greatly reduced hazel densities. Burning 2 times over 4 years maintained it, and burning once elevated those numbers. Here's at year 11, so right at the end of that active burning period. Again, look at the control and now the dormant burns. Burning 10 times in the spring, 10 times in a row, doubled the amount of hazel density. Burning 5 times over 10 years, burning 2 times over 10 years in the spring, increased hazel density over that 10-year period. Looking at the summer burns was essentially eliminated in the annual burning. Burning 5 times in the summer over 10 years, greatly reduced. Burning 2 times over 10 years, increased hazel density. There's a little bit of information about the soil conditions around year 3 and 4. Compared to the control, the duff layer was 1.1 inches less. 3 in this annual, burning 3 times in the spring, compared to 1.6 inches difference here with the summer annual burns. And in the ANOVA tests that were run at this time, those were statistically all different from each other. Here, they didn't use some of the same metrics that we use today, but the duff layer was drier during the summer period compared to the dormant season. So the duff layer had greater consumption and acted more like a fuel. And you'll see this in other studies in other locations where there's less moisture, there's less energy required to evaporate the water and allow that duff layer to then be a conductor of heat and increase that heating. We know some of the tissues here did get above that 140 degrees Fahrenheit because there's mineral soil exposure, and they had notes saying the root structures and charring on the structures were visible after the summer annual burns, these repeated summer annual burns. Some other notes about the soils in year 11, about the summer annual, is these first 2 layers in general were consumed and missing after 10 years. In general, the forest floor nutrients had moved down here to the mineral soil. And the report from year 11 was about tree production again. And so they just talked about soil productivity in general being unaffected for something like tree growth at this site because the nutrients were retained in general on site even though there was this movement. In terms of the overstory trees, basal area, growth increment, mortality, they were similar across these different prescriptions. And I'll just show you one example of that. So here we have the different frequencies in each box, and the lines represent the different seasons in the control. The error bars all overlap. There's no letters here indicating statistical difference. So there was no statistical difference in something like tree density. And this was the same pattern that we found in these other stand characteristics. So in summary, the short-term results after 10 years of very different prescriptions showed specifically that repeated summer burning had some short-term effects over these 10 years, that being a reduction in stem density of that woody layer in the understory of this red pine forest, thinner duff layers, and reduced nutrients in the forest floor. So now we have 2 examples. Prescribed fire can be effective for something like woody encroachment for restoration objectives. But how long do these ideas and the signature of these different management systems last? It takes a lot of money, a lot of resources, a lot of planning to put fire on the ground. So if managers and organizations can meet their short-term goals, they're really happy about that. But if this can move them forward to that desired future conditions decades later, even better. So the more they can hone in their application now, the more that's going to pay off later. And we had the rare opportunity to go back to this study 45 years later. So Jessica and I, some of our collaborators, received funding to remeasure some components at this study site. So we had that active fire period for 10 years, very different prescriptions, and then a 45-year fire-free period to see how that stand, and the understory responded decades later. So I'll show you some of the same variables I showed you earlier, and we'll call these the long-term results. So we have density on the Y, time is on the X, 1960 through current times. And each line is going to represent the control. Here's going to be the dashes. So we already talked about the short term, that there was differences. I showed that earlier. I want you to focus on the red circles. All the bars are overlapping. There's no letters indicating significant difference. So burning 5 times or burning 2 times over those 10 years in the 1960s, we didn't see any difference. It didn't matter the season. It looks the same as the control. So now this is like a game show, because you know I didn't show you the first one. So how many think the summer annual, it's either going to be below the control, the same as the control, or above the control? How many think it's below the control 45 years later? Okay. How many think it's the same? How many think it's above? Okay, half the group did participate, but that's okay. Well, the winner was, it's the same as the control, but it's statistically different than the dormant season. So decades later, burning 10 times in the 1960s, in the spring, 10 times summer burns in the 60s, 45 years later, those 2 prescriptions remain different. The problem of woody encroachment still higher in those dormant annual burns and remain low in the summer annual burns. Compositionally, this is proportion of the biomass. And by the way, we did look at biomass on those other graphs, and they just accentuate those differences between the different prescriptions. Just real broadly, it's mainly hazel here is number 5, and other shrubs are included here. 4, sensitive hardwoods, this is like maple. When we look at present composition, what pops out right here is SA is summer annual, summer biennial. Number 1, pine species coming in, predominantly white pine. 3 here, this is sensitive conifers, so like balsam fir. And then the smaller portion of shrubs. So compositionally, there's been a shift over the decades. Here's one photo. So here's the old fire break. Over here, this is the dormant season when this photo is taken. So the leaves are off, and you can see the brushy hardwoods under here. And here's the summer annual with white pine and balsam fir dominating the understory. If you were here 1 year ago, you would have seen Joshua James present some of these results. I'm not going to show all his results, but just remind you of a few of them. And one is that 45 years later, the duff layer continued to be thinner than the control. That was a persistent effect, along with nutrients such as N, P, and K being lower than the controls. We won't go through the whole table, but you'll see a lot of SAs in this column and a lot of negatives in this column. In terms of the overstory trees, these are set up the same way. Frequency and the lines are the seasons. The control, you'll see in all of these, separates from the burn stands. And so for the overstory trees, it wasn't as sensitive to the season of burn. They broke more into unburned stands versus burn stands. And so this is just trees per acre. So the burn stands 45 years later had lower densities. And what was happening here is in the control stands early on, any of the balsam fir or red maple that may have been there were allowed to continue to grow. And so this is just looking at those trees 4.5 inches and larger, so they grew into that size class over time. In the burn stands, whether it was a spring burn or a summer burn, those sensitive, fire-sensitive species were taken out. So they had to recruit in later, and so there is a delayed recruitment of those types of species later in the stand's development. And so that's what you're seeing here, some of them starting to come into that 4.5 inches. This was the same pattern we saw with basal area. These are more open structure, the burn stands versus unburned stands. When you have more growing space, this means there's more room for a tree to grow, so mean diameter was larger in the burn stands. And I already mentioned the delayed recruitment in the burn stands. We also looked at things like growth efficiency and vulnerability to drought, and those were unaffected by the different prescriptions. So, in summary, 45 years after those fires stopped, the persistent effects included with repeated spring burning, there was elevated densities in hazel, the woody encroachment. The opposite was true for repeated summer burning. Those densities were reduced. There was a thinned up layer, less nutrients in the forest floor, and more fire-adapted species. And burning in general lowered stocking, and there was larger trees in these stands in the long term. So back to some of the take-home messages. Depending on your objective, some of these effects can be persistent for decades. So back to the original problem that we talked about at the beginning. Is prescribed fire an effective tool for restoration? Depending on the objective, yes. So that's me saying thumbs up to fire activity, that it can work for some objectives in restoration. With some of the other variables that we looked at out here, there's opportunity to develop open structure and also deplete some of those nutrient stocks, which are important to enhance the ability of some of these fire-adapted species to compete on these sites. So now am I going to recommend that all managers should burn 10 times in the summer to reach their restoration objectives? No, I think it's more about providing information, knowing those benchmarks so they can make informed decisions that are right for their project areas. In general, good practices would be to use more than one burn if you feel fire is an important tool to bring back some of those aspects to the ecosystem. Vary the season of burn. And lastly, use multiple tools. So one thing they're using at the Muckwa area, we've seen this in northern Minnesota, in other places in Michigan, using some mechanical treatments to put some of that live fuel on the ground so some of that moisture can come out and it can contribute to some of the dead fuels on site to that fire. Other considerations, what are the current conditions? How far away are current conditions from that desired future condition? And what do you know about the historic fire regime? So there's a recent paper from the Muckwa area suggesting that only 20% of those burns were during the summer. So dormant season burning has a place in management. It just depends on what the objectives are. And lastly, of course, all applications should be focused on the objectives of the project as they are lined out by the landowner and management agency. Now that said, that's really great. I get the thumbs up for doing that slide. But the reality is putting fire on the ground is hard. It takes a lot of resources. And it's not just about understanding the historic fire regime and so forth. Jessica, Kathleen, and I had the experience in 2017 to be ready to work with our partners at the Schwamigan National Forest to get out and do our measurements right after the fire in 2017. We wanted to collect ash, there were severity measurements to do, And this started in May, and I think it was number 1 that limited us in May. And then we moved into June, and then it was priorities because the sharp-tailed grouse was breeding. So then we moved into July, and I think it was the capacity. We didn't have the personnel because they are all out west. It was a high fire year. We went up and down this list. About every 2 weeks it was switching around. In the end, we didn't burn that year. So we burned in 2018. So there's a lot of factors that go into actually applying prescribed fire in these management project areas. That said, dormant season spring burning is the most common in our region to use. And there's good uses for dormant season burns. They can reduce fuels pretty quickly in those hazardous conditions. They also can be used for maintenance. Once you're in a condition, a desired condition, it can maintain the sites. That said, our project at the Muckle Barrens is important because there's been few studies in our region looking at such detail of the fire properties. We have a lot of instrumentation, the details of the soils. We're doing a seed bank component. And so it's a very multidisciplinary project. And we work very closely with our management partners at the Schwaming Nicolay. They're on the calls with us. They're at the table with us as we put together our research plans. We do have, I want to mention, an upcoming webinar. If you want more information, I didn't spend much time today talking about this project, and then there's another one already on file on the website. The Lakewood project that I mentioned is just, the treatments are just going on the ground. And so this is a planned long-year, 50-year study that we plan to do with them. Again, it's also a research management collaboration. Some different components from the Muckwa study would be the wildlife components. We have pollinators being studied, as well as some social science components, looking at the landowners who are very embedded in this landscape and who put their hunting cabin here in 1930 because they loved woods around them, and now we're opening that up and we're using prescribed fire. So there's a lot of interest in what's going on around them. And the cut-foot burn study, it's going on too. But trees just keep growing, right? Red pine can live up to 200 years. We're up here at 145. This is just a schematic of that study, the cohort, age 90, short-term results, the different fire we put in, different measurements here from the long-term results. And we're thinking about combining some silvicultural treatments along with some more understory treatments on this site and looking at that response another 50 years and regenerating that stand. So the work goes on. For future research, looking at doing a lot more of this integrated tools, using multiple tools at the stand level and integrating them at the landscape scale. So in the last 40 minutes, I've kept you in your comfort zone talking about prescribed fire, gave you a few examples about how it's considered an essential tool for restoration in these large project areas, and how when you use prescribed fire, the effects can vary depending on what your objective is. So it's important to think about the prescription and the timing and the frequency of that to reach those objectives in these restoration areas. With that, again, I want to thank all these people and all the funding. And let me just point out, like the Lakewood area, that's 32,000 acres. So we're talking about thousands of acres being shared with research to look at some of these issues. And we're talking decades, so generations of scientists who have maintained something like the cut-foot burn study over the decades. I think I figured out I'd be this scientist looking at this, something like that. So, and thank you again to Jessica and Kathleen for your contribution so I could share with this group some of the work that we're working on. I did provide a lot of references in my presentation. If you would like a copy of anything I referred to, just let me know. And with that, I can take questions, and I wish you all an enjoyment of your own fire in the near future.
Minnesota side. And when they applied the spring burn, it stimulated the biomass of the hazel, that's correct, compared to the summer one. And I'm wondering what's the mechanism that stimulated the
Yeah, why was there more in the spring? I'm thinking it's the carbohydrate reserves. So they prepared for winter in the dormant season. The leaves went off when fall started. They haven't even leafed out yet, and they were top killed. And so they still had all their reserves to rebuild biomass. And so less capability of doing that in the summer.
It's even more biomass compared to the control, right?
Yes.
No more stems, not necessarily more biomass.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Is that true? I mean, could it happen such that you burn so you get lots of sprouting going on? But if you actually compared the biomass in those treatments.
The biomass was different. There was more biomass. And I did show that.
And stems.
Correct.
Both.
Yes.
So how about light competition as an explanation? You singe off a whole bunch of the needles and branches of the surrounding trees and you release light competition. They're ready to sprout and they have more light, they grow better.
Yeah, that's a good point too.
I did similar research in Tennessee, and I found that it was really hard to separate out fire behavior effects and like carbohydrate phenology of the plants. And so I'm wondering, do you have any sense on why you steer towards the phenology and root carbohydrate cycles instead of maybe consistent differences in fire behavior across the seasons?
What do you mean by fire behavior?
I mean, like, so you definitely had differences in duff consumption between the seasons of burn. So that would maybe suggest that fire intensities were just different consistently across the seasons, and maybe that was driving some of those effects. I don't know. I feel like you have to set up the study to look at that, and I always ran into the, well, I'll just talk circles in my discussion about it. So, I don't know, like what?
Yeah, unfortunately we don't have a lot of information on fire severity from the study other than what I showed you and the responses we're getting from it. But I think that's a good point that I'll have to put in the discussion point.
Talk circles.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's really interesting. It's so cool to see such long-term research, and I'm just really interested to know like what the funding situation is, because you mentioned, I think, the Lakewood Southeast project has got a 50-year, like going forward 50 years is the plan for the research. Can you talk a little bit about the funding situation? Because I mean, certainly with what we do with tropicable forests, it's unheard of to get that kind of length of project.
Right. Well, the funding situation isn't great. And what happens is we get really creative and we really partner. So something like the bird component from that study, there's someone on the district that we have a good relationship. We all like each other. We look forward to meetings so we can see each other and catch up on the side and then talk business. And so because there's that kind of a camaraderie around the project, someone on the district who has good bird ID skills and they okayed it with their district ranger that they can spend a certain % of their time doing the surveys for us. So we're not hiring an outside person. We get a lot of in-kind contributions to do it. And then to do some of the field work, to get it off the ground, we did get seed funding from the Forest Service to do that. And now at this point, because the treatments are happening over 32,000 acres, they just can't do all the treatments in 1 year. So it's a staggered process over the next 10 years, which means our follow-ups are spread out too. So that means we can finagle some help from different projects. We have some volunteers that are interested to come out. So this would not be a traditional, like, huge MSF type of project. We're really working in kind and working in partnerships with the organizations in that landscape who are interested in it. And something like the Cutfoot study, the investment was in the 1960s. That's where all the money really was put on the ground. Now it's a matter of coming out and measuring these plots. So in terms of vegetation, that's something we can pull off pretty easy from in-house. Doing some of the extra work we did require some extra funding, but actually pretty minimal. We really got a lot out of that, the grant that we got for on shoestring budget, and if we can set it up, then to start applying for grants to make that even bigger.
In the Cutfoot study, I've read both the Buckland and Ellen papers, of course, but was there any pine mortality? I mean, these were pretty old trees, so I imagine the crowns were way up there and probably not much scorch occurring. And I don't recall whether there was any pine mortality from these birds.
I didn't mention this, but they did do a commercial timber harvest before they started these treatments. And one of the reasons they did this was to remove some of the snags and remove some of the trees with the characteristics that you were describing, so they could have more control over that fire as it moved through. They also wanted similar basal area across all these different treatments, so that would be a factor. So in those 10 years, we did go back and we looked at the overstory tree data, and there's no difference in mortality. And so we think part of that is because they came through with the commercial timber harvest and took out anything that might have been affected. We also went and looked at things like fire scars. Really, there's very few of them. So, 45 years later, we didn't see evidence of major tree damage either.
We still have time for more questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, just I guess a couple questions about management. I'm just not familiar about before, but I actually didn't realize that was for sharp-tail management wise. I just thought it was like a school for you. But are those, say those oak grubs, are they undesirable in that situation for sharp-tails? Are they trying to get little and big blue stem and things like that in there instead? Is that so? I'm just wondering about the management objectives.
Right.
Really want to switch to summer burns to try to eliminate some of those.
Yes, they are interested in that. They're interested in desired composition with more big blue stem and more of that type of mix in there. I do know sharp-tail, structure is important to them, and so there's certain heights where they need clear opening for flying and so forth. And I don't know what the cutoff is, but I'm sure oak grubs are going to be a part of that. And I don't know if you guys remember what that height threshold is for that bird, but yeah, there is some component of that. They can't have it all just oak bushes. There has to be some mixture of grasses and forbs for open habitat.
Okay, and I guess I'll follow up to that in your pine study that you have. I was thinking what the objectives for burning are in a situation like that. Is there a desire to diminish the poreless shrubs in those situations? And if so, it'd be interesting to compare that to much cheaper methods like using herbicide and thinning and combination of those things.
Right, and that's what we're thinking for next steps at that study is to address some of that. And some things that may be not to have such a monoculture in that understory, maybe to have more of a mixture for wildlife and other components in that stand where you would want to set that back. But coreless does provide mass. There are reasons why you want to keep it in a stand. It's not a bad thing, just maybe not a uniform sea of it in the understory.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
Were there any rare plant species that popped up following the burns that weren't detected before some of these fires were implemented?
Yeah, we haven't. We're hoping that with the seed bank study,
Right,
we
that's what I mean, yeah.
like ancient, loom plants would come out, but we haven't seen that yet. And the National Forest is doing their own surveys and monitoring in addition to what we do in a very structured research way, and nothing specific in the recent 2 burns that we've been involved in. But it's on the watch list.
We did have a county record for landing strips.
Oh yeah.
And there are sensitive species on the landscape, but
Yeah.
not that have popped up since
Right.
our burns. Any last questions? Great, thank you all for your attention and participation.